Welcome to Audit the Audit, where we sort out the who and what and the right and wrong of police interactions. This episode covers probation officers, Fourth Amendment seizures, and traffic stops, and is brought to us by WB's channel. Be sure to check out the description below and give them the credit that they deserve. On August 4th, 2021, Alabama resident William Barnwell was driving behind North Carolina probation and parole officer Harold Mashburn while he and his wife were traveling home from a vacation in Cherokee County, North Carolina. Mr. Barnwell claims that Officer Mashburn was driving slower than the speed limit in the left lane for several miles, so Mr. Barnwell passed him on the right side when the lane opened up. Officer Mashburn then held up his badge and motioned for Mr. Barnwell to pull his vehicle over to the side of the road. Mr. Barnwell complied.
Sir, you can film me all day long. If you're a police officer, you should have a body camera. Because you're not a police officer. It says right there you're a probation officer. I'm not on probation. I've never been in trouble for anything.
In the state of Alabama,
tell my camera again how you're a police officer.
Well, you answered my question. I've answered yours. Now, let me ask you a question. In the state of Alabama, what are your probation officers considered to be?
I have no idea. We're not in Alabama.
Okay. Do you live in Alabama? Because your tag says you're in
I guess when a police officer gets here, we'll determine a whole bunch of stuff.
Okay.
How often do you pull someone over?
How often? I pull people over.
How often do you drive in the left lane for 5 miles going 48 miles an hour?
I wasn't doing 48 miles an hour, sir.
So how fast were you going?
I was doing 55.
And what happened?
You come flying up on
No, when I passed you, I was going 48 miles an hour. But if your car here that's not a police car had the radar in it, you would know how fast I was going.
Yes, sir. And I'm able to do speed estimations.
I'm sure you will be. I guess when your real police officer gets here, I'm sure I'm going to get some tickets.
All right. Well, you just stay tight. Just hang tight, okay?
What's your name? Would you like to identify yourself?
Have you going to give me your driver's license?
You're not a police officer.
Okay, then you just sit tight.
So you're refusing to identify. You're refusing to identify yourself.
Just sit tight.
You're refusing to identify yourself, even though you pulled me over.
Sit tight.
Mr. Barnwell refuses to provide his identification to Officer Mashburn because he is a probation and parole officer, not a police officer. Probation and parole officers are assigned to monitor criminal offenders who are sentenced with probation instead of jail time, or granted parole after serving time in prison. The role and authority of probation and parole officers vary greatly between states, with some states employing certified law enforcement officers in this role, and others considering probation and parole officers to be court officials that serve more of a social work function than a police function. Along these lines, some states consider a probation officer to be a peace officer, and others do not. There are also gray areas in between these two extremes, with some states granting probation and parole officers limited peace officer status by empowering them with peace officer authority in certain situations. In North Carolina, Section 15-205 of the General Statutes outlines the powers and duties of probation officers, stating that, quote, "A probation officer shall investigate all cases referred to him for investigation by the judges of the courts or by the Secretary of Public Safety." The statute details additional duties that probation officers have in managing the individuals on probation under their supervision, and states that, quote, "A probation officer shall have, in the execution of his duties, the powers of arrest, and to the extent necessary for the performance of his duties, the same right to execute process as is now given, or that may hereafter be given by law, to the sheriffs of this state." Therefore, while probation officers in North Carolina have limited authority to arrest their probationers, they do not have a general peacekeeping duty, and none of their duties or powers involve the public at large. While it is possible that Officer Mashburn's conduct would be justified under the authority granted to probation officers in other states, under the law of North Carolina, it seems clear that Officer Mashburn was acting outside the bounds of his authority as a probation officer when he stopped Mr. Barnwell for driving aggressively.
Am I being detained? Am I being detained, sir? Because I've got to go home. Are you detaining me? Are you detaining me? Am I being detained? Hey, I'm going to step out. Because you're... Am I being detained because I need to be on my way? Is this a lawful stop? Am I being detained? Are you detaining me? Are you detaining me? Is that hard to understand? Because you know this is not legal.
Mr. Barnwell repeatedly asks Officer Mashburn if he's being detained, and Officer Mashburn refuses to answer. An individual is considered seized for Fourth Amendment purposes when an officer intentionally terminates or restrains their freedom of movement through physical force or a show of authority, such as an officer turning on police lights or sirens, flashing a badge, or ordering an individual to stop. It is well established in legal precedent that a traffic stop constitutes a seizure of every individual in the stopped vehicle, including both passengers and drivers. As the Supreme Court articulated in the 2007 case of Brendlin versus California, the standard for whether an individual is being detained is whether, quote, in view of all of the circumstances surrounding the incident, a reasonable person would have believed that he was not free to leave, or whether, quote, a reasonable person would feel free to decline the officer's requests or otherwise terminate the encounter. However, when it comes to detentions initiated by shows of authority, the court explained that, quote, there is no seizure without that person's actual submission. For example, if an officer orders an individual to stop, but they continue to flee, no seizure has occurred. However, what constitutes submission depends on what a person was doing before the show of authority. So if an individual is sitting in a chair, they can submit to a show of authority by not getting up to run away. Applying these standards, it seems probable that a court would conclude that Officer Mashburn seized Mr. Barnwell by showing his badge, motioning for him to pull over, and telling him not to leave, as a reasonable person would likely believe they were not free to leave, regardless of whether Officer Mashburn was technically permitted to conduct traffic stops as a probation and parole officer. And Mr. Barnwell submitted to Officer Mashburn's show of authority by pulling over his vehicle.
This is not legal. And you know this. Hey, I'm going to leave now because you won't tell me if I'm being detained or not.
Well, evidently you are being detained.
Am I being detained? Say it. Sir, am I being detained? Will you say those words? You can either, am I free to leave? Am I free to leave? So I am being detained. Why don't you answer that? You're not talking to anybody now. What am I being detained for?
Well, if you paid attention to me and listened to me a few minutes ago, I was trying to explain all this to you, sir, but you did not wish to listen to me. You wanted to talk over me.
Am I being detained? I'm going to go home now. I'm going home now. Am I free to go? Am I being detained? So now he's going to get my tag number. How long does a Terry stop last, sir?
I'm not doing a Terry stop.
So what am I being detained for? Am I being detained? Am I being detained?
Aggressive driving is what you've done, sir.
Sir, you know you pulled me over 15 minutes now. How long is a Terry stop?
After informing Officer Mashburn that he has been pulled over for 15 minutes, Mr. Barnwell asks him how long a Terry stop can last. Although traffic stops often involve Terry stops, they are not one and the same. In the 2009 case of Arizona versus Johnson, the Supreme Court held that a traffic stop constituted a lawful investigatory Terry stop, quote, whenever it is lawful for police to detain an automobile and its occupants pending inquiry into a vehicular violation. However, as we've discussed many times on ATA, there are limitations on how long an officer can detain an individual during a traffic stop. As the Supreme Court explained in the 2015 case of Rodriguez versus United States, quote, a relatively brief encounter, a routine traffic stop is more analogous to a so-called Terry stop than to a formal arrest. Like a Terry stop, the tolerable duration of police inquiries in the traffic stop context is determined by the seizure's mission to address the traffic violation that warranted the stop and attend to related safety concerns. While officers may conduct certain investigations that are unrelated to the traffic stop, such as checking the driver's license, determining whether there are outstanding warrants against the driver, and inspecting the automobile's registration and proof of insurance, these checks cannot, quote, measurably extend the duration of the stop unless there is a reasonable suspicion of a separate offense that justifies continued detention. Similarly, the North Carolina Supreme Court held in the 2020 case of State versus Reed that, quote, in the context of traffic stops, we recognize that police diligence includes more than just the time needed to issue a citation. An officer is permitted to ask a detainee questions unrelated to the purpose of the stop in order to obtain information confirming or dispelling the officer's suspicions. However, an investigation unrelated to the reasons for the traffic stop must not prolong the roadside detention. Unfortunately, it is not feasible to apply this legal framework to this situation, as Officer Mashburn likely did not have the legal authority to detain and investigate Mr. Barnwell, and the reason for the extended duration of the stop was to wait for a police officer to arrive on the scene. All things considered, it seems more probable that a court would conclude the initial detention was unlawful, rather than concluding that the detention was lawful but unlawfully extended.
Can you call your supervisor? Call your supervisor, please, right now. Thank you. Hey, you see that? If you're out here patrolling the highways...
Yeah, I got one person at a time that I can deal with, sir.
How fast was that car? You're an expert on speed. How fast was that car going?
Wait. Just calm down. Just calm down. One, if you'd relaxed and had a conversation with me here, we'd probably be both going about our ways of doing our jobs. You going home and me going to do my job. You understand what I'm trying to tell you?
I understand what you're trying to say.
The only thing I was doing was stopping you, getting you pulled over, so one, you calm down and quit endangering other people's lives.
I wasn't endangering nobody's
Yes,
lives.
sir. Yes, sir.
We're in more danger when you got me pulled over right here than we were out here going up and down
And
this
that's
highway.
by possibility of truth.
So I'll tell you what I'll do.
No,
Since we're
no.
talking and being calm, will you answer one question for me, and I won't say another
I'm
word
not
to the state
asking no
trooper.
more questions.
Am I being detained?
You have been stopped until I can get a trooper here to have a talk with you, because you cannot talk to me.
Why is that not a yes or no question?
Well, because I've done answered that question. You asked me, are you being detained? I've said, you have been stopped.
But you won't say,
Yeah.
am I free to leave then? Since you won't answer
I've
that
already
one.
answered that question.
So you won't say if I'm being detained
I've
or not?
already answered that question, sir.
Hey, sir.
Yes, sir.
How are you?
I'm good.
Good. Hey, look, I don't really fully understand what we're
Me either.
doing right here. Okay, so he just felt like you were aggressively coming up on him. He's a probation officer. Okay, so I'm not gonna write you for anything. I'm not doing anything like that. Okay, you got your insurance here.
I'm
sure
wound
your
up, and
licenses are good.
you're
I understand.
unwinding me. I appreciate
understand,
that.
Okay, so where you headed to? You headed back home?
Home to Alabama.
Okay. All right. So look, it's one of those things. Okay. You may have come up on him a little quick. He may have, it's one of them things. Okay. So as long as, I mean, like I said,
I'm good. I'm good now. I'm calm and way down.
I don't have anything to write you for. I don't have anything like that. I'm not going to do any. Even if I'm not going to. It's not my stop. He just feels, he just felt like you come up on him a little hard. You might have been a little aggressive. So if that is the case, let's just back it down a little bit. You're nearly to Georgia anyway. So,
That's why I say I can
you
see
know
it.
what
I
I'm saying?
appreciate it.
So,
After being detained for approximately 30 minutes, a police officer arrived on the scene and allowed Mr. Barnwell to leave without further incident. Mr. Barnwell posted several videos on his YouTube showing the interaction, and the situation has received some local media attention. In an interview with the press, Department of Public Safety spokesperson Greg Thomas said that Officer Mashburn did not have the authority to stop other vehicles, and stated that officials are investigating the matter. As of the date of this episode, it is unknown whether Mr. Barnwell will be pursuing legal action. Overall, Officer Mashburn gets an F for conducting a traffic stop without the authorization to do so, falsely detaining Mr. Barnwell and his wife, and for misrepresenting and blatantly disregarding the bounds of his authority as a probation officer. It is impossible to accurately speculate on the events that led to this encounter, but if Officer Mashburn was concerned that Mr. Barnwell's driving was a danger to himself or others, then he should have immediately radioed for a uniformed officer and provided them with Mr. Barnwell's license plate information, not attempt to make an unsanctioned traffic stop. Mr. Barnwell made it readily apparent that he did not believe that Officer Mashburn had the authority to make a traffic stop, and immediately called 911 to have an officer come to the scene. And instead of returning to his vehicle until an officer arrived, Officer Mashburn attempted to force Mr. Barnwell to identify himself. Officer Mashburn demonstrated a considerable degree of negligence from the moment he initiated this stop, and continued to overstep the bounds of his authority as a probation officer until a legitimate member of law enforcement arrived on the scene. Officer Mashburn was either highly misinformed about the limitations of his law enforcement authority, or maliciously disregarding it. And either way, his conduct certainly warranted the ongoing investigation. Mr. Barnwell gets an A-, because although he could have exercised his right to silence more tactfully, he remained calm and collected throughout the encounter, rightfully challenged the legitimacy of Officer Mashburn's conduct, and maintained a respectable balance between complying with Officer Mashburn's orders and ensuring that his constitutional rights were respected. It was completely reasonable for Mr. Barnwell to be skeptical of an individual waving around an indistinguishable badge in an unmarked vehicle in an attempt to pull him over, and I commend Mr. Barnwell for thinking quickly and calling 911 to have another officer come to the scene. All that said, Mr. Barnwell likely could have benefited from remaining silent until another officer arrived. as mentioned in the episode. Some states and local governments do employ sworn law enforcement officers as probation officers, and there are some states where a probation officer would have the authority to conduct a traffic stop, especially if the driver presented a serious danger to other motorists. If Mr. Barnwell had been in one of those states, then this interaction would have likely had a much different outcome. The responding trooper gets an A+ for approaching the encounter calmly and objectively, actively working to de-escalate the situation, and for engaging in a civil dialogue with Mr. Barnwell. Officer Mashburn had several minutes alone with the trooper to explain his side of the story before the trooper approached Mr. Barnwell's window, but the trooper did not offer deference to Officer Mashburn and quickly realized that Mr. Barnwell needed to be released. It is clear from the video that the trooper had no intention of citing Mr. Barnwell, and it seemed as though he understood that Mr. Barnwell had been questionably detained and just wanted to get Mr. Barnwell on his way without any further delay. I commend the trooper for refusing to take sides and dissolving the encounter as quickly and fairly as possible. Be sure to give your support to WB's channel. You can find a link in the description below. Let us know if there is an interaction or legal topic you would like us to discuss in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to check out my second channel for even more police interaction content.